Welcome to Spiritual Naturalism Today, a conversation on science, nature, and spirituality. Our program is sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society with host Daniel Strain.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Daniel Strain, and I'm here with my co-host, B.T. Newberg. Hello, B.T.
Hi.
Today, we're going to be talking about happiness. Our motto in the Spiritual Naturalist Society is happiness through compassion, reason, and practice. Well, we've talked about compassion, we've talked about reason, we've talked about practice. That's maybe the only other word that we haven't really talked about. What do we mean by happiness? Happiness is such a general word. We have a lot of words in the English language that are so flexible and so generalized that you really have to get down to specifics of what you're talking about when you get into philosophy and the spiritual practices that these philosophies are based around. So, we're going to be examining what we mean by happiness when it comes to spiritual practice. Do you have any opening remarks or thoughts, BT?
Well, good to be back, first of all. I used to be on this show a lot, and so back as a guest. Yeah, I've got plenty of thoughts. I thought a lot about this when I was designing the course, but to be honest, I actually kind of want to hear your thoughts first, because I feel like I've kind of molded over long enough that I've kind of arrived at what might be a bit of a deviant point for our community, perhaps. So,
that's interesting. Let's let that be a teaser then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So why don't you introduce basically what you mean by your kind of happiness?
Okay, I think what I'm going to say is fairly compatible with what's in the course. And the course, for those that don't know, the course that BT is referring to is our Introduction to Spiritual Naturalism course that we have in the Society. You can take it at your own pace on our website. And what I mean by happiness, often I like to use the phrase true happiness to distinguish between all these other different forms of happiness. I really like the ancient Greek term eudaimonia, but it's a little too esoteric, or whatever you want to call it, for these days. A lot of people don't really use that word, but the reason a lot of times people refer to these ancient Greek words is because they don't exactly translate, and sometimes they capture the meaning just right, and there's not really a great translation in English. So eudaimonia, eude means good or healthy.
Yeah, the you part is good, right?
You're correct. You, and then the daimonia, daimon refers to kind of like your inner spirit or your soul, or we might say mind or psychology today. So basically, it literally means it more literally means healthy soul, and then it has also been called flourishing. So when we're flourishing in life, it's referring to more than just we're experiencing pleasure or delight, but referring to well-being, all-around well-being. So person that's experiencing well-being will be happy in the more basic sense, but they'll be happy in a healthy way, in a way that is simply the reflection of their living a healthy, well-balanced, prosperous life, inner prosperity I'm talking about here. And so I think along with that comes an equanimity or a peace of mind, a kind of acceptance and calmness of inside. That doesn't mean not having very, pleasant, joyful moments, but it does mean kind of like an even keel. You're not constantly on the roller coaster of pain and pleasure back and forth, these wild, jerky types of things. And then overall, it means, a happy life means the good life, in both senses of the word good, where we can, it's the kind of life you would want for your child, or the kind of life you'd want for a loved one,
Right, and the objectively happy life rather than the subjective feeling of happiness that we usually refer to, right?
Yeah, and this kind of happiness is not so dependent upon circumstance. As a Stoic, I believe that it is possible to have happiness regardless of circumstance, but that's a little, you have to really get into some of the idiosyncrasies of Stoicism to understand why and how that can be. It might be good enough to say for the general practitioner that not so dependent upon circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's kind of my little opening spiel. What do you think?
Yeah. So yeah, I like flourishing as a way of describing it. When you introduced the topic to me, Daniel used the word true happiness, and I think you mentioned that once maybe so far. And I think flourishing I like a little bit better, just because true seems a little bit, I don't know. I prefer some way of describing it that's less like mine is the more real one than yours is, kind of a thing. So flourishing, I think, works pretty good as an English way to describe what we're talking about, if we're not going to use the Greek like eudaimonia or something. Now, the way the Greeks kind of might have distinguished that a little further might be between the temporary feeling of happiness, which is what most of us mean when we say, oh, I'm happy today. I'm feeling really happy. You have a temporary feeling that's a positive affect and, feels like everything's going good right in the moment. But as we all know, it doesn't last. It barely will last a day. It'll last a couple of hours, and then you'll be kind of back to set point sort of thing. But I think the Greeks called that hedone, kind of a pleasure.
Coming from hedonism.
Well, that's where hedonism comes from, rather.
Or similar, root.
Yep. Verse is the flourishing one, where it's more like a mind state, and according to some philosophical schools, at least, it really doesn't have much to do with emotion at all. It's just the purely objective happiness, where the idea is that someone from the outside can look at the circumstances of your life and say, that's a happy life, right? Like, you've got, everything that everyone would want out of a life. But it doesn't even necessarily refer to emotion. So that's just sort of a dichotomy that I'm setting up, because I want to completely undermine that dichotomy now.
Well, before you undermine it, can I do a little undermining myself?
Sure, go for it.
So I agree with you on the doesn't necessarily have to do with emotion.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the objective from the outside looking in, one of the things that I have been struck by seeing some various writings and documentaries on happiness is that you could have a person in fairly dire circumstances, or what we would consider, a poverty type of circumstance, and then they're very happy. And then meanwhile, you have other people that have private jets and all kinds of things like that, and they commit suicide. They're so much suffering in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe this is where you're going, and I don't want to take the steam out of that if that's the case, but I would just say that to me the kind of happiness that we're talking about is not really something you can say, well, they're happy because they have this, and this is their conditions or situation.
Right. I totally agree with that. Right.
Oh,
But I would go even further, I guess, by saying that even if what you're talking about is sort of like a mental state of clarity where you're just so together and like in tune with what you can do and what you can't do and what you can expect and what you can't expect, and that nothing brings you down because you don't have any dashed expectations or any of those sorts of things that the Stoics or the Epicureans or the Skeptics or other Greek schools, or if you want to go to, say, the Taoists or other, all over the world, any of those sort of like objective mental states or systems that don't necessarily reference emotion at all, I want to actually challenge that right there.
okay.
Because I think what you're really getting at when you pursue that kind of goal state, whether you want to call it nirvana or an awakening or sagehood or whatever you want to call that, I think what you're really after is a feeling, but it's not the same as that happy feeling that I was describing. It's a sense of meaning. It's a sense that the world makes sense and everything has a place. And that's something that modern psychologists are now coming to distinguish in their studies of happiness, the difference between the happy feeling and the sense of meaning. Two very different things. You can be happy, but without a sense that what you're doing is meaningful. And you could be deeply, deeply interwoven with the order of your life and how things work, and just engaged with the world in a sense that feels very, very meaningful to you, but without feeling happy. And that's a really important distinction to make. So I think that the greater kind of happiness that we might be trying to talk about here is more on the end of the sense of meaning, but I would not go so far, though, as to say that it's like devoid from a feeling. I think that even when we're talking about a sense of meaning, it's a different kind of feeling, but it's a feeling. And one of the reasons why I say that, go ahead, Daniel.
Oh, I was just going to say, I agree with your use of the word feeling. At least in Stoic scholarship, there's kind of a distinction. I mean, they didn't really use the word emotion, but they did have something that was maybe closely related, or more closely translated as feeling. Mm-hmm. And to me, I think emotion and feeling are kind of different. So when I say it's not an emotion, I think there are feelings. They're kind of like these impulses we feel, and I guess you could call them emotions, but emotion to me is a lot more like feeling would cover all sorts of subjective sensation, whereas emotion is a lot more
there's a lot of play
impulsive and fiery. I don't know if I'm
but also emotion has a lot of range to it. Like you can have a compassion state that's not very much in terms of impulse at all, and it's not fiery, but it's like almost closer to just a state of mind, but yet it's still thought of as an emotion. It's kind of a squishy word that way.
Yeah,
but
it's kind of fuzzy. And all these different philosophies, they really nail these things down. They say this is what this means, and they define it as such. And we're kind of having this conversation, moving in and out of different traditions, and kind of cross comparing. And so naturally, our words can get a little fuzzy here too. But I think conceptually, though, it's good of you to distinguish between, you're saying this is a feeling, but it's not, exactly the same.
Yeah, ultimately what I'm trying to say is that even when we're looking for something that seems like just a purely logical conclusion about how your mind should be, or how you should live your life, right? Like saying, for example, the Stoics arrive that virtue, there's nothing better than virtue, being in accord with nature, and it doesn't even reference any kind of specific experiential content, really. It's just like, no, duh, like you live the only way that nature will allow you to live because that's how the world works. But I think that even so, what we're looking for, or at least what I'm looking for, is an experience. And here's why I think that. Because so many times in my life, I've explored so many different philosophical systems, different philosophical and religious paths and whatnot. And I've always come to the end of that being like, wow, I found this really great system that makes sense and can describe the world. But unless I actually feel like I have a social belonging, like I have a community or something where I belong to something that is all like wrapped up in this same kind of way of thinking, I no longer really, I lose enthusiasm for that system. It's not that I feel like this system's any less valid, but just suddenly it doesn't have an appeal. And so I think that sense of meaning, which human beings tend to get largely through social validation, I think that is really an actual experiential thing that is being chased when we talk about flourishing, happiness, true happiness, however you want to put it.
Like a passion in life, right? Which maybe the passion comes out of your sense of meaning, but sometimes people's sense of meaning, they get their sense of meaning from something that's tied to an external circumstance that's not really within their control, and then they get into trouble. When it comes to happiness, they get disillusioned, or they get, because inevitably there's going to be disappointments and things that happen. But, like for myself, for example, I feel like I have passion in my life. I'm very passionate about the Spiritual Naturalist Society, for example, and I'm very passionate about what we're doing and all that kind of thing. But and I feel like it gives my life meaning. But at the same time, one of my practices, I always try to remember that one day I'm going to be dust, and one day everybody I know will be dust, and one day everybody who ever heard of me will be dust, and one day all of humanity may be dust, will be dust, certainly. But yet, I still find meaning in what's going on. Not that there's inherent meaning, and this is very interesting when it comes to naturalism, because as naturalists, there's not very many naturalists who would claim that there's just sort of this inherent meaning that just exists in things apart from ourselves. We give it meaning. We are the meaning makers. But yet, as a naturalist, I still feel that there's meaning in my life because of the passion that I have for things, and the Stoics would say that it's that attuning yourself to virtue, which is the thing that gives you a goal set, a passion, a thing to make your life be about, and that's in accord with human nature. And that when we live in accord with our nature as social beings, as rational beings, as compassionate beings, that the natural result will be our flourishing.
So with the passion that you mentioned, I would separate that from the sense of meaning. Certainly it can contribute to a sense of meaning, but passion comes and passion goes. You have a passion for something, then you get burned out for a while, then you come back to it and you might have a spark again. But a sense of meaning is a little bit more overarching than even that. By a sense of meaning, I mean this sense that everything kind of fits together. And there's something that you grok that makes sense. You feel like you have a place in the world, you know your place in the world, and it makes sense. And when you have that, here's the interesting part for me. Even when you have the complete lack of passion, even when you have unhappiness, even when you have times of sorrow, even when you have times of any number of negative mental states or emotions, if you have a worldview that makes sense of that, then even that is imbued with a sense of meaning. So, for example, like a Wheel of Fortune kind of image where, there's a cycle of life where, sometimes you're on the up, sometimes you're on the down, and that's just part of how it goes. That's out of your control, that it's out of your control that you're sometimes going to experience suffering, right? That kind of worldview helps you be able to make sense of even the unhappy times. And so you end up with this thing that sounds like a paradox when you say it in English, that you could be happy even when unhappy. But when you really understand what we mean by this greater kind of happiness, or, this flourishing, it does make sense.
Yeah, even in the face of big tragedy, like this year I lost my father, and even in the face of those ultimate kinds of tragedies or losses, there's a resilience that this kind of happiness provides. You see two people, if we imagine two hypothetical people, one that is flourishing and one that does not have this kind of happiness, and maybe they both go through the same or similar kinds of events. One of them is defeated, crushed, or their life falls apart. They don't know who they're oppressed by it. And the other one, they go through mourning. They recognize what's going on. They're not in denial. They feel what they feel. But ultimately they know, like you said, that they already have this kind of bigger picture of how things are. And to me, it's like, at least within, our tradition, within my tradition and everything, it's about recognizing that there is a beauty to this grand tapestry of nature that's bringing forth and making possible everything we do love and enjoy and experience in life. And all of that is only possible because of that impermanent, ever-changing flux. And so, it's this perspective shift where I was talking to somebody the other day on email, and I said, when you're driving down the road and you see a dead animal in the road, this is an experience a lot of us have. You see the dead animal, and for some people it can ruin their day. And, there's a good thing about that, which means that they're a compassionate person and they feel empathy, and they love animals, and they care that something else, died or what have you. And that shouldn't be dulled. That's a good thing, but it does point out that if you're driving down the road and you see the dead animal and you are moved to whatever degree, it's not about the event. It's about the fact that you forgot that dead animals are off in the grass and in the bushes and in the trees, and that dying is happening all around you and within you and all around and throughout nature all the time. And the degree to which you are shocked by that, or surprised by that, or moved by that, is a measure of that ignorance that we all have, that we constantly forget our circumstances. Right. And mindfulness is about being mindful of that bigger picture, that larger picture of the cycle of life and death, and whatever degree of solemnity or respect or reverence you're called to when you see that dead body in the road. That just means that you were missing that before. You were kind of allowing yourself you put it in the back of your mind, and it doesn't mean we should go around depressed about death, everything's dying all the time. But it means that we've incorporated the reality of our situation into our well-being and found a way to flourish within that reality as it is, not like we would want it to be or imagine it to be.
Right.
And so the only difference with the dead animal in the road is that it's in a clearing that allows your eyes to see it.
Right. It's thrust in your face.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that gets really hard to deal with. I mean, that right there is one of those lessons that's just like, it's a level 1 lesson that's just a no duh, but yet it's like a level 100 lesson to actually be able to fully grasp in your life. And it's never more true than when it's thrust in your face with like a death in the family. And Daniel, I know that you've dealt with a death in the family this year. I've dealt with a death in this family this year, and it's devastating. And it'll show you what's really inside your mind, despite all your pretensions of how advanced you've become. You know?
Yeah. And it's very easy for us to, because we want to be more enlightened. We want to be further along in our practice, to try to make it that way, fake it till you make it. And we try to, and it's easy to kind of, pretend you are until something happens. And then you realize where you really are, just like you said.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it is possible to make genuine progress along that road.
Yeah.
And I can tell you the difference between events of similar magnitude at different states in my life, and the difference of how I handled them was a reflection of that progress. When I compare and I think back and I think of how I am now, and a big part of it to me is you have to have a sense of sort of an aesthetic sense of beauty about the universe that is not attached to your individual goals as an ego. I want this, I want that, I want to live, I don't want to die, I want some chocolate cake, I want, this job, I want this car. That's the little skill set going on inside of this little lizard robot thing that you happen to have evolved in. But if you can shift your kind of locus of reference outside of that little mechanism and shift it more toward a big perspective of the universe, the cosmos, life, the interconnectedness of all things, then I think you start to, it's not just an intellectual idea. Like you said, it's a feeling. You have to feel this connection, a relationship with the cosmos, the kind of thing that...
Experience it more than feel it, maybe, but it's an experiential thing.
And Carl Sagan was so good at conveying in words these kinds of feel, or at least, bringing up within us those kinds of feelings when he talked about the cosmos. And, to me, that's kind of where that resilience comes from. And it's not like you're thinking, oh, the universe is going to look out for me. I think we're all kind of like ants clinging to a log in a storm, and maybe a wave will come one day. And, it's not that, nature has this benevolent protection over us, like you can't just transpose God for nature in that sense. But it does mean that there is a certain nature to reality, and that nature is what has allowed us to spring up in the first place and what makes everything possible. And so, but it takes that getting outside the ego.
So that right there, that vision that you just described of the cosmos and nature and everything, the way I would look at that is a means of making the world make sense to you.
Yes.
When you're able to behold that vision, then you grasp you experience a sense of meaning, because everything seems to then have its place. And, Yep, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, you go ahead.
So I guess I was going to go on then to make the larger point, just to reiterate more, rather, that when everything has its place, then even the negative experiences and times are also meaningful. And the word resilience that you brought up, I think, is a good launching point for that talk, because to me, the first thing I think of when I think of resilience is like a ball bouncing or something. That's like, oh, you're going to have a little whoopsie doodle, but you'll bounce right back. And of course you do bounce back, because we're human beings and that's what happens. But I would rather think about the darker times in life as themselves being meaningful, not being a whoopsie doodle, not being a drop the ball, but it bounces back up to your hand, but rather being a descending and a rising back up. That has a place in the wheel. To me, that makes it all the more meaningful and important, and it grants it something that it would not otherwise have in the way that I look at the world.
So it's kind of a hope for a future state?
No. Well, I mean, that's there too, but no, it itself, without having anything else around it, is meaningful, because it's part of who and what we are as human beings, of this particular species, of this particular variety that came out of this particular evolutionary process in this particular cosmos. This is who and what we are. This is our home. And to me, when you fully accept that, that is uplifting in its own way. Even if I'm so sad about it, you lose somebody in your family. You feel sad, because humans feel sad. You feel shitty. I'm sorry, but it's feeling shitty. But feeling shitty is meaningful.
Yeah.
It's who and what we are.
I'm going to get kind of nerdy here, because I'm a Star Trek fan, as you know. And Star Trek has many times illustrated this point in various different stories. Mm-hmm. I can think of two right now. One is for the fans of Voyager. There was a holographic doctor.
Yep.
The computer character, right? And he, but he's intelligent. And they make him so intelligent where you're thinking, okay, well, he's probably like actually conscious and everything. But he wants to experience what life is like and for humanity, and he wants to, broaden his understanding and all that. So he makes a holographic family. And at first they're all perfect, and then the rest of the crew tells him, you just made everything too perfect. Right. That's not reality. And so they reprogram it to be more realistic, where anything could happen. And then, his daughter gets some disease and she's going to die and all this. And so he turns it off, because he has emotions too. And he turns it off and he says, I canceled that experiment. I decided I didn't need to do it. And they were like, hey, in real life, you don't get to jump out when it gets uncomfortable. That's part of life.
You don't get to abort the program.
Yeah, and so the other example from Star Trek that I'm thinking of comes from the original Star Trek, and unfortunately, it was not one of the best movies in my opinion. But Star Trek, The Final Frontier, was Spock's brother has this psychic power to like turn people into. He takes away all of their negative memories, and so they kind of turn into this happy, blissful zombie. And then he can control them and everything. And Captain Kirk says, I don't want my pain taken away. I need my pain. It makes me who I am. It builds everything I've come to be. Is included all of those different experiences.
Yeah.
And so anyway, that's what I was reminded of as you were saying that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I'm a big Star Trek fan myself, actually. I didn't remember Star Trek 5 though. I might have to go back and watch that.
Yeah, that's the only good part of that movie. It was one of the odd numbered movies, and so for a while they had a thing going where only the even numbered movies were very good.
Well,
now we're gonna get hate mail.
To put a fine point on what we're talking about here, to kind of draw it together and conclude a bit, at least for my part. I guess I want to kind of pull it together by saying that when we think about happiness as like the goal or the desired state, even if you belong to a path where it's like the goalless goal where you can only attain it by not trying to obtain it, that kind of a thing. It still is like esteemed and idealized. Happiness is, right? And to me, I feel like because of the fact that happiness, in my mind, includes a whole lot more than positive feelings, I feel like I make progress toward that flourishing kind of happiness the more I accept that it's really not all that different from normal experience. It's just that you understand all of the texture of it so that it all fits together, like I was saying, that you get that sense of meaning. No matter what, it's hard to think of happiness without also thinking of something that's like pseudo-paradisical, you know? It's just hard to avoid that.
And it would be kind of inhuman to expect to go through life with this, like, you know, smile on your face no matter what happens.
Right.
But, you know, it still might be hard for some people to parse out the difference between pleasure and happiness. The Stoics talked about joy, and that was an approving thing. They said this joy, but joy arises from true judgments about the world, whereas delight was this other very different technical kind of thing that arose from false judgments about the world. Things you tell yourself are good are not necessarily good. Maybe they're just neutral, but you tell yourself that because you're feeling this direct pleasure from it. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with pleasure. Pleasure can be a spice in life, and that's wonderful. But pleasure is a poor substitute for happiness because it's so fleeting. And so the Buddhists talk about this, what's it called? It's called the something wheel of chasing, you know, one light after the other.
Is that the dharmic wheel or the
hedonic wheel?
Or is it? Yeah, okay.
Maybe it's the hedonic wheel. I don't think that's Buddhist, but it's compatible with Buddhism. But that term, I think, is something.
Yeah, it's escaping me at the moment.
Yeah, but anyway, it's that chasing one thrill after another, one pleasure after another. That is what a trap that a lot of people fall into. They're trying to find happiness. They're trying to find flourishing, and they don't really know how to get there, so they just chase pleasure after pleasure after pleasure. And like I said, pleasure's fine, but not as a substitute for happiness. And so to really get to happiness, it's hard to communicate to people, well, how can you be happy regardless of circumstance? How can you be happy when your possessions are lost, or your reputation is ruined, or your job is lost, or you lose a loved one? You know, how can you be happy? And we don't really have time to go into the details of Stoic philosophy, but I just really love the way they do it. They parse things out in such a way where you start to look at things differently, and you start to your locus of value shifts, so that what you're valuing is not the immediate pleasure, but you're moving your sense of value to be on what kind of person you want to be. And if you're trying to be a virtuous person, a compassionate person, and that's your goal, and that's kind of where things seem meaningful to you in that way, and you shift your goal to something more compatible with our deeper nature as human beings, a healthy psychological nature, then what you start to do is it doesn't become about achieving certain external circumstances. It becomes about doing the thing because it's the kind of thing that the person you want to be would do. And so if I want to, feed the hungry, it's not about necessarily even being successful in that endeavor. I'm not going to feed every hungry mouth in the world. There's going to be people that I can't help. But it's about the fact that I am living that life trying to do that. and that's having a formative effect on my character, and it's given me a sense of fulfillment. So even then, it's not about the external circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can rest knowing that we are living that good life in that sense, then the good life in the other sense will follow.
Mm-hmm. The way I would look at the external circumstance bit, and I'm a little bit different here, but I think ultimately we're mostly compatible. I would say that in my way of making sense of like the ups, the downs, all part of the meaningful pattern, external circumstance is always going to affect you as a human being, always. But what it affects is primarily your feelings, emotions, mood states. The meaningful pattern can still be seen in those effects, in your ups and downs that external circumstances bring. Yeah. And thus, no matter where you find yourself on that pattern of ups and downs, there is simultaneously also an appreciation of that meaning that brings a flourishing. And I do totally acknowledge that you can lessen to a lesser degree or sometimes to a greater degree how much the external circumstances influence your mood state. Some people seem to be able to do it, to an almost supernatural seeming degree, and that's also possible. But ultimately, I feel like as human beings, we belong to the world, and the world always will affect us. And so I like to think of us as interwoven with those external circumstances. But as long as you see that full pattern, there's another dimension to it that is able to be appreciated, that meaningful sense.
It sounds like your tilt is more toward Epicurean, and mine is more toward Stoic in that regard about the external circumstance. Those guys have been arguing about that for centuries. But as you know, I think it is true, like you said, that an extraordinary amount of, an incredible, surprising amount of conditioning can happen within a Homo sapien mind, to where it almost seems supernatural. I mean, when you see, monks who are able to sit in a meditative pose and not react as they're on fire, and things like this. But, yeah. But it is also, in a practical sense, unrealistic to form everything around that when the vast majority of people just don't have the time and the ability to ever get to that kind of a level. So it can't
and are not going to find themselves on fire.
Yeah, it can't be about that. It has to be about what can we practically achieve. I think those ideal models are very helpful.
Yeah,
because they kind of point the direction what we're going for, and you say, well, how does that person get that far? Maybe I can get a little further by examining that. But also there are these intermediate steps along the way, and that's what's great about it. Spiritual naturalist enlightenment is not this immediate moment where you just suddenly are joyful and happy and enlightened, and before you weren't. It's this progression, and you see continuing rewards the further along you move. I want to come to something real quick, because you've been talking about meaning and everything making sense and all that kind of stuff. People are generally very familiar with how supernaturalists do this, particularly in our culture, Christianity, for example. They'll say things like, well, God has a plan, and in the end we're all going to heaven. That's how they make sense of all that. What a lot of naturalists don't necessarily have, and one of the reasons why SNS exists, is to know, well, how can naturalists make sense of something that makes sense to them given our scientific world? We look and we see in a way that isn't just we all turn into worm food and that's it. And so that's a fascinating topic in its own right. How does a naturalist make sense of things in a satisfactory way? What would you say to that?
I think that you were already getting at it earlier. At least the way I do it, was what you were describing, and that's getting back to that vision of the cosmos, the vision of big history, the vision of evolution, and how the scientific explanation of like there are reasons why we are the way we are because we come out of the world which is as it is, and so that sounds so like high level, abstract, like this could never have anything to do with myself. We're talking about black holes and stars right now. Or like bacteria in a boiling ball of goop way back millions of years ago. No, but it really, 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 really has a very immediate and deep effect on personal life when you really grasp what it means for you. And to me, it's really driven home by Michael Dowd and one of his stories of his experiences. So Michael Dowd, longtime listeners of this show will probably have heard, I think he's even been on the show, right? But he's a evolutionary evangelist, he calls himself, right? So he used to be a Christian fundamentalist, and now
he's also on the advisory board of the SNS.
Yep. Yeah, and now he's kind of flipped to the other side and goes around in a van with his wife Connie Barlow, and they preach the good word of evolution, basically, right?
And especially lately, they've been focusing on the importance of tending to our environment. They're doing really good work.
Yes. Now, the thing that the example from his life experience that I want to draw on in order to really drive home that this could really be very personal and meaningful in everyday life is he found back when he was a fundamentalist, that as he rose in sort of status within his community, basically, became a little bit more of a respected and revered figure within the Christian fundamentalist movement, he was having trouble with infidelity. And of course that went against everything, all the values that he stood for. And it was eating him alive because he was thinking, how can I be a shitty person? I mean, I don't want to be this person. What's going on inside me? And it's just like, am I really just a bad person? And he was riddled with guilt. It was destroying him. But the way he looks at it now, while not excusing anything about his behavior, gives him a sense of meaning that comes out of who and what we are as evolved human beings. Now he understands that there's a reason why we evolved certain like lusty behaviors and why that's related to rises in status, because it's been shown in scientific studies that as you rise in status, you also have a spike in testosterone, which increases your risky behavior tolerance. That's not the right way to say it. That's not the technical term, but basically you're more prone to risky behavior, which makes you, which drives you to take greater risks and be able to spread your seed further by taking risks outside of your established mating relationship, right? And that has obvious evolutionary advantages if you're trying to spread your genes, right? So there's a reason why we're built that way. Doesn't excuse anyone from that behavior, but it gives a meaningful, it gives that shitty behavior a reason to exist and a place within the big picture where he's no longer being like, am I a bad person? Now he's like, oh, I'm an evolved human being. It makes sense that I would have these feelings. Now let's just get on with dealing with them. And he is much more at ease with himself and presumably much better at keeping faithful as well.
Well, so evolutionary psychology for the naturalist kind of filled that position that for the literalist Christian used to be the taking a bite out of the apple and the fact that we're all born with sin that the myth of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man and our evil nature because of that was kind of what filled that spot for the literalist Christians.
Well, that Augustinian type theology, yes, but there are so many different other strains that came along, and like I feel like within many strains of Protestantism, there's a real sense of like, if you're a bad person, it's because you're a really bad person. It's not because of original sin. It's like, no, there's a difference between the elect and the condemned.
Yeah, well, that's a good example of how, you know, the naturalist perspective and modern scientific understanding can be incorporated into our worldview to help us. Speaking of which, I guess we're getting close to the end of our time, but I would feel remiss not bringing this up. We haven't really spoken about the role of biochemistry in happiness, and how does that interplay with all this philosophic spiritual practice stuff we're talking about? Because that's a really, I mean, maybe we could almost do a whole other episode on just that, because I mean, it's a huge can of worms to open here in the last few minutes. But you know, in our society today, we have all of these various medications, and there are a lot of people saying that we're over medicated and that they're too easy to get, and doctors are prescribing them too much, and there's all this economic motivation, you know, big businesses trying to make money kind of behind the whole thing. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who have been really helped by these things when they are used properly in the right conditions. So, you know, I feel like there is a lot of underappreciated power in cognitive therapy and in the kind of philosophies and practices we're talking about. And so that makes me want to say, well, let's at least, you know, have people try that first before they go to something that may have a lot of long-term side effects and things like that. But anyway, that's a huge, complicated issue.
Yeah, that is a whole other episode. That's true. The one thing I would say is nothing has been driven home to me more the older I get than the fact that there are all different kinds of people. And the kind of person that you and I are, Daniel, and probably that a lot of our listeners are, is a fairly slim segment of the overall population. And for those of us who enjoy introspection, who yearn for introspection, who get a kick out of introspection, I think that definitely introspective practices like cognitive therapy and whatnot can be a huge help. For other kinds of people, it may or may not be. I have certainly encountered people that I deeply respect and consider to be very intelligent and very engaged with their life, but who have gotten absolutely zilcho out of meditation.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I think, you know, just like with the religious issue, we're here to provide some interesting pathways that people can explore and learn about to whatever level is right for them. And we don't get into judging people about what they do or what's right for them. And I think that's a great stance to take in all of this. You know, we're just here to talk and share ideas. And yeah, I agree with you, though. That would be a neat topic to approach as a whole episode. So it looks like we're about at the end of our time. Did you have anything else you wanted to add to close us out?
No, I think that's pretty good.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's, you know, these topics are huge in every single tradition, not to mention a multi-traditional kind of approach we've been taking here. So, you know, if you're interested in this kind of thing and want to learn more, check out our website, check out the course, check out more episodes of the podcast, the articles. You know, there's all kinds of things we're doing here. And let us know what you think. We have a comments page on each episode. And so feel free to leave a comment there or to write us at our contact page on our website. So, and now, by the way, we've got a simpler website. It's snsociety.org, which is a little shorter to type than spiritualnaturalistsociety.org.
Oh, okay.
So either way, you can get to us with either name.
So the old URL still works and goes to the
Yeah,
same
we had to leave that because a lot of people have it bookmarked and what have you. But
Okay.
but the shorter one it'll get you there too.
Yeah, the old one was quite long. So spiritualnaturalsociety.org, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure, fair enough. Oh, I did want to mention that you brought up the course again. So everything that we've been talking about today, the course is solidly focused on all of this and drills way down deep into it.
Absolutely.
We have only been able to just give the broadest overview, and skipping all the important details and all the important steps and the building blocks of how you even get to, So yeah, I mean, the course covers a whole range of topics related to spiritual naturalism, but the pole star around which the whole celestial cosmos of the course turns is really this idea of flourishing.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, for those that don't know, BT designed our course, and it has been serving us very well. We have a lot of people now who have become our alumni, people who have taken the course and completed it. And we built a little list recently this month so that they could all keep in touch and continue to learn from one another. So,
Yep.
Yeah, anyway, so that's our episode for today. And please join us next time. Feel free to have a look at our other episodes if you haven't already. And hope you have a wonderful month. Thank you.
This program was sponsored by the Spiritual Naturalist Society. Learn more and become a member at spiritualnaturalistsociety.org. Our music was composed by John Clemisrude. Please share our program and join us next time on Spiritual Naturalism Today.